Hello and welcome to Umber Dreams Archives. I'm glad you've joined me, ready to slow down, breathe deeply, and let your thoughts drift back through the quiet corridors of time. This is your moment to leave the noise of the day behind, to step away from screens and deadlines and the relentless rush of now, and step gently into the windswept highlands of ancient Anatolia, where an empire once stood as powerful as Egypt itself, yet somehow vanished so completely that even their name became a mystery. For 3,000 years the Hittites were forgotten, their cities buried beneath Turkish farmland, their treaties sealed in clay and lost to memory. Here, in this space between past and present, we wander together through an empire that fought pharaohs to a standstill. We walk the stone-paved streets of Hattusa, perched high in the mountains where kings once issued decrees in cuneiform script. We stand before massive gates guarded by stone lions, monuments to power that crumbled into silence. We imagine the scribes pressing wedges into wet clay, recording treaties with Egypt that would survive millennia in forgotten archives. We picture the bronze smiths who revolutionized warfare, the merchants who traded from the Aegean to Mesopotamia, the lawmakers who wrote codes protecting the accused centuries before such ideas appeared in European thought. Each episode here isn't just about dates and battles. It's not about memorizing dynasties or cataloguing ruins left behind. It's about the lives lived. The scribe carefully translating diplomatic letters between empires, the soldier standing guard at mountain fortresses, the queen wielding power alongside kings in ways that startled their Egyptian contemporaries. It's about the stories whispered through weathered temples and forgotten fortresses, the mysteries sealed in clay tablets waiting in museum drawers, the echoes of an empire that refused to stay buried forever. If you enjoy these quiet journeys through time, a like and a subscribe help keep this channel alive, help us continue exploring together. But for now, you don't need to do anything but listen. In the British Museum, locked away in a wooden drawer labelled simply Correspondence Miscellaneous, there once sat a collection of clay tablets that would rewrite everything we thought we knew about the ancient world. These weren't beautiful artefacts. They were brown, cracked, covered in wedge-shaped marks that took decades to decipher. But when scholars finally translated them in the late 19th century, they discovered something astonishing. The tablets were letters, diplomatic correspondence between the pharaohs of Egypt and the rulers of a vast empire that rivaled Egypt in wealth, military might, and cultural sophistication. The empire's name appeared again and again in these ancient documents: Hatti, the great kingdom of Hatti, the Hittites. And yet, despite their obvious importance in these Egyptian records, despite their treaties and wars, and royal marriages documented in meticulous detail, virtually no one in the modern world had ever heard of them. Unlike Egypt with its pyramids, or Greece with its temples, or Rome with its roads, the Hittites had left almost no trace in popular memory. Their cities were ruins beneath Turkish soil, their language was dead, their achievements were forgotten. How does an empire disappear so completely? How does a civilization that ruled for half a millennium, that fought pharaohs to a standstill, that developed revolutionary technologies and sophisticated laws, simply vanish from human consciousness? This isn't a story about a minor tribe or a forgotten village. This is the story of a superpower, erased. The ancient Egyptians knew them well. In the 14th and 13th centuries BCE, Egyptian scribes wrote anxiously about Hittite expansion. Pharaohs negotiated carefully worded treaties with Hittite kings, addressing them as equals, something Egypt rarely did. When Ramesses II described his enemies at the Battle of Kadesh, he spoke of the Hittites with a mixture of respect and fear. They were not barbarians to be crushed. They were rivals. The Bible mentioned them too, though only in passing. In the Old Testament, the Hittites appear as one of several Canaanite peoples, a detail so minor that scholars for centuries assumed they were simply a small local tribe. No one imagined they had been an empire, but the clay tablets told a different story. They spoke of a capital city called Hattusa, perched high in the Anatolian mountains. They described vast territories stretching from the Aegean coast to the borders of Mesopotamia. They detailed complex bureaucracies, professional armies, international trade networks, and a legal system so advanced it included protections for the accused and compensation for victims, concepts that wouldn't fully emerge in European law for another 3,000 years. And then, around 1180 BCE, it all ended. The cities burned, the empire collapsed, and within a few generations even the memory faded. By the time classical Greece emerged, the Hittites were already ancient history, so ancient that the Greeks themselves had no clear knowledge of them. Homer never mentioned them. Herodotus, who travelled widely and recorded countless peoples and places, said nothing. They had become invisible. For 3 millennia, the Hittites existed only as a footnote, a mysterious name in Egyptian and biblical texts, a puzzle with no solution. Farmers in central Turkey ploughed their fields over massive stone foundations without knowing what lay beneath. Travellers sketched strange ruins without understanding their significance. The empire that had once terrified pharaohs was reduced to silence, buried under centuries of wind and rain and forgetting. This is the story of how we found them again, how archaeologists and linguists pieced together fragments of an empire from broken tablets and weathered stones, how we learned that the ancient world was far more complex, far more interconnected than we had imagined, and how we discovered that even the mightiest civilizations can vanish, leaving barely a whisper behind. The Hittites are waiting, patient beneath the Turkish highlands, ready to remind us that history is full of empires we've forgotten, and perhaps full of empires we haven't even found yet. Imagine Anatolia in the early 2nd millennium BCE. Not the Turkey you might know today, with its bustling cities and modern highways, but a land of deep forests, rushing rivers, and mountain valleys where small kingdoms rose and fell with the seasons. This was the world before the Hittites, before anyone dreamed of empire, when survival meant mastering the harsh geography and the even harsher politics of Bronze Age Near East. The landscape itself shaped everything. The Anatolian plateau sits like a fortress in the centre of modern Turkey, ringed by mountains, cut through by rivers, blessed with minerals that would become the foundation of ancient power. To the south lay the wealthy cities of Syria and the Levant, where Mesopotamian culture spread northward along trade routes. To the west stretched the Aegean coast, where Mycenaean Greeks were beginning to build their own palace civilizations. To the east, the kingdoms of Mesopotamia, old beyond measure, fought their eternal wars for dominance, and in the centre, in the highlands, lived scattered peoples speaking a language that linguists would later identify as Indo-European, related distantly to the tongues spoken in India, Persia, and eventually Europe. These weren't nomadic barbarians. They were farmers and metalworkers, traders and warriors, living in small city-states that controlled the valleys and mountain passes. They built with stone and timber. They worshipped storm gods and sun goddesses. They buried their dead with ceremony and care. Around 1900 BCE, something changed. Perhaps it was population pressure. Perhaps it was climate shift. Perhaps it was simply ambition. One of these city-states, a place called Kusara, began to expand. Its king, a man whose name has been lost to time but whose descendants would remember him as the founder, started conquering neighbouring territories. Not just raiding them for plunder, but absorbing them, creating something new, something larger. His successor, a king named Anita, pushed further. He conquered the city of Hattusa, a strategic stronghold in the north-central highlands. The clay tablets tell us he destroyed it completely, then cursed the ground so thoroughly that he declared anyone who rebuilt the city would be struck down by the storm god. It was a dramatic gesture, the kind of thing kings did when they wanted to make a point. Hattusa had resisted. Hattusa had been made an example. But empires have short memories when ambition calls. Within a few generations, a new dynasty arose, and they did exactly what Anita had forbidden. They rebuilt Hattusa. They hit their capital, and they took the name of the land they conquered as their own. They became the people of Hatti, the Hittites. This was approximately 1650 BCE, though dating Bronze Age events remains imprecise. The king who established Hattusa as the new capital called himself Hattusilidamd, meaning the one from Hattusa, a name that announced his intentions clearly. He wasn't just another valley king. He was building something permanent, something that would outlast him. The location was perfect for defence. Hattusa sat on a rocky outcrop surrounded by steep gorges, approachable only from the south. The Hittites would eventually enclose it with massive stone walls, some sections still standing today, running for miles around the city. They carved gates decorated with lions and sphinxes. They built temples and palaces and archives. They created a capital worthy of an empire. But in those early years, it was still fragile. The surrounding kingdoms didn't recognize Hittite supremacy. The people of the highlands maintained their local loyalties, and to the south, the great powers of the age, Egypt and Mitanni and Babylon, paid little attention to these mountain warriors. They were provincials, interesting only if they controlled trade routes or caused trouble. Hattusa would give them reason to pay attention. He campaigned south into Syria, attacking the wealthy cities that controlled the trade in tin and copper, the metals essential for bronze weapons and tools. He pushed into territories that had never seen Anatolian armies before. He won battles, he seized treasure, and he brought it all back to Hattusa, where he used it to build monuments and reward followers and strengthen his grip on power. The pattern was set. The Hittites would be a military power, an expansionist kingdom, an empire built on conquest and maintained by force. But they would also be something more. They would develop laws and treaties. They would create archives and preserve knowledge. They would adopt the cuneiform script of Mesopotamia and adapt it to their own language. They would become, in time, one of the great civilizations of the Bronze Age. But that was still ahead. In these early days, in the valleys and mountains of Anatolia, before the great battles and treaties and monuments, the Hittites were simply trying to survive. They were forging an identity from scattered tribes. They were learning to govern diverse peoples. They were discovering that building an empire was far harder than conquering one. The world didn't know it yet, but something new was being born in the Anatolian highlands. A power that would challenge Egypt. A civilization that would revolutionize warfare and diplomacy. An empire that would last 5 centuries before vanishing so completely that even its name would become a mystery. But on those early mornings, when mist filled the valleys and the sun rose over Hattusa's stone walls, the Hittites were just beginning their story. They couldn't know they would be forgotten. They couldn't imagine that 3,000 years later archaeologists would dig through their ruins trying to remember them. They were simply living, building, fighting, dreaming of glory, the way all empires begin. Charles Texier wasn't looking for an empire when he rode into the Turkish highlands in 1834. He was a French architect and archaeologist, hired by the Ottoman government to map ancient ruins, a common enough occupation in an age when European scholars were rediscovering the classical world. He expected to find Greek or Roman remains, perhaps some Persian fortifications. He did not expect to stumble upon one of the greatest archaeological mysteries of the 19th century. Near the village of Boğaz Kal, in the wild country east of Ankara, Texier encountered something that stopped him cold. Massive stone walls emerged from the hillside, running for miles in both directions. Monumental gates carved with lions and sphinxes, weathered but still imposing. The foundations of what had clearly been a major city, spread across a landscape of rocky outcrops and steep gorges. This wasn't a minor outpost. This was a capital. But whose? The local villagers had no stories about the ruins. Ottoman records made no mention of any great city in this location. The stones bore inscriptions, but they were in a script Texier didn't recognize. Not Greek, not Latin, not even the cuneiform he'd seen in Mesopotamian artifacts. This was something else, something older, something lost. Texier sketched the ruins meticulously. He measured the walls and gates. He copied the strange hieroglyphic inscriptions as carefully as he could, though he had no idea what they said. When he published his findings back in France, he speculated wildly about what he'd found. Perhaps it was Tyria, a city mentioned by Herodotus. Perhaps something Roman after all. He didn't know. No one knew. The ruins sat in the Turkish countryside, magnificent and mute, waiting for someone to recognize them. Decades passed. Other travellers visited and added their own sketches and speculations. German archaeologists arrived and surveyed the site more thoroughly. British scholars examined the inscriptions and declared them unreadable. The mystery deepened. Then, in the late 19th century, other pieces of the puzzle began emerging. In Egypt, archaeologists working in the ancient capital of Akhetaten, the city built by the heretic pharaoh Akhenaten, discovered an archive of clay tablets. These were diplomatic letters, written in Akkadian cuneiform, the international language of Bronze Age diplomacy. Among them were letters from someone calling himself the King of Hatti, writing to the pharaoh as an equal, discussing treaties and royal marriages and territorial disputes. Hatti, the same name that appeared in the Bible's vague references to Hittites. But these letters didn't describe a minor tribe. They described a major power, one that, negotiated with Egypt on equal terms, scholars began to wonder if the biblical Hittites might be more significant than anyone had assumed. Meanwhile, in Boğazkale, a German archaeologist named Hugo Winkler arrived with a new theory. What if these mysterious ruins were actually Hattusa, the capital of the Hittite Empire mentioned in the Egyptian letters? What if the Hittites weren't just a biblical footnote but a lost civilization? Winkler began excavating in 1906. Almost immediately his team made an extraordinary discovery. Buried in the ruins of what had been the royal palace, they found an archive. Not just a few tablets, but thousands of them. Clay tablets baked hard by the fire that destroyed the city, preserved for 3 millennia, waiting to tell their story. The tablets were written in cuneiform, the wedge-shaped script of ancient Mesopotamia, but most were in a language no one could read. A few were in Akkadian, the diplomatic language Winkler knew, and these provided tantalizing clues. They spoke of treaties with Egypt, they named Hittite kings, they confirmed that this was indeed Hattusa, the capital of a forgotten empire. The news electrified the academic world. Here was physical proof of a civilization that had somehow vanished from human memory. An empire that had ruled for centuries, that had challenged pharaohs, that had left massive stone cities and detailed written records, and yet had been completely forgotten. It was as if Rome or Greece had simply disappeared from history, leaving future generations to puzzle over scattered ruins and unreadable texts. But the tablets remained largely unreadable. Scholars could identify proper names and a few Akkadian words borrowed into the unknown language, but they couldn't translate full sentences. The grammar was strange. The vocabulary was unlike anything in known ancient languages. The Hittite Empire had been found, but it was still silent. The clay tablets were catalogued and photographed. Copies were distributed to universities across Europe. Linguists analysed them from every angle, looking for patterns, searching for some key that would unlock the language. The inscriptions on the stone monuments, those strange hieroglyphs Texier had sketched decades earlier, remained equally mysterious. 2 different writing systems, both unreadable, both essential to understanding this lost world. Winkler continued excavating until his death in 1913. His team uncovered temples and fortifications, residential areas and administrative buildings. They found evidence of sophisticated urban planning, of a society organised and literate and powerful. But without the ability to read the tablets, the Hittites remained frustratingly out of reach. The texts were there, the ruins were there, the evidence of a great civilization was undeniable. But the language, the key to understanding who these people really were, what they thought, how they lived, that remained locked away in wedge-shaped marks on clay. Somewhere in those thousands of tablets were treaties and laws, religious texts and historical records, letters from kings and queens, inventories and contracts and poems. An entire civilization's written legacy, preserved by accident, waiting for someone clever enough or lucky enough to crack the code. The Hittites had been found. Now they needed to be understood. And that would require a different kind of genius, someone who could look at an unknown language and somehow, impossibly, make it speak again. The academic world didn't quite know what to do with the Hittites. On one hand, here was undeniable physical evidence, massive ruins and thousands of clay tablets, proof of a civilization that had clearly been important. On the other hand, it all seemed impossible. How could an entire empire, one powerful enough to negotiate with Egypt, simply vanish from historical memory? Surely someone would have remembered. Surely there would be more references, more traces, more continuity. The skeptics had reasonable arguments. Perhaps these ruins weren't really Hittite at all. Perhaps Hattusa was just a provincial capital of the Assyrian Empire, or a satellite state of Egypt, and later historians had exaggerated its importance. Perhaps the Egyptian letters referred to some other Hatti entirely. Perhaps the biblical Hittites were unrelated to these Anatolian ruins. The absence of evidence was itself suspicious. Where were the references in Greek and Roman sources? Where were the stories and legends? Some scholars suggested the tablets might be forgeries, though this theory collapsed quickly under examination. The clay was genuinely ancient, baked hard by fire millennia ago. The script was consistent with other cuneiform documents from the Bronze Age, and there were simply too many tablets, scattered through too many rooms, for any forger to have manufactured them all. No, the tablets were real. But what did they really represent? Others argued that even if the Hittites had been important in their own time, they were essentially a footnote to the real powers of the ancient world. Egypt, Mesopotamia, Assyria, these were the civilizations that mattered, the ones that influenced later Greek and Roman culture. The Hittites were interesting, certainly, but not significant. Their disappearance from memory simply reflected their actual historical importance, minimal. But as more tablets were examined, as more Akkadian texts were translated, this dismissive view became harder to maintain. The Egyptian letters weren't vague or uncertain. They described the king of Hatti as the Great King, a title reserved for equals. They discussed military conflicts where Egyptian armies had been fought to a standstill. They negotiated treaties that established borders and trade agreements. This wasn't how Egypt talked about minor powers. Hugo Winkler, exhausted and ill from years of excavation in harsh conditions, defended his discoveries, passionately. He published preliminary reports describing what he'd found, the scale of the city, the sophistication of the architecture, the volume of the archives. He argued that the Hittites must have been a major civilization, comparable to Egypt or Babylon, but he couldn't prove it definitively because the tablets couldn't be read. The controversy spilled into popular publications. Newspapers ran stories about the mysterious lost empire. Some were breathlessly enthusiastic, declaring that a civilization rivaling Egypt had been discovered. Others were more cautious, noting that most of the evidence remained untranslated and that claims of Hittite greatness were still largely speculative. Museum curators faced practical questions. Should they create Hittite exhibits based on such uncertain evidence? Should they invest in acquiring Hittite artifacts when the civilization's importance was still debated? The British Museum hedged its bets, displaying a few pieces with careful labels noting the ongoing scholarly discussion. The Berlin Museum, where many of Winkler's finds ended up, was more confident, creating dedicated Hittite galleries. Meanwhile, archaeologists continued working at Boğazkale and other sites across Turkey. They found more cities with similar architecture and inscriptions. They uncovered rock reliefs carved into mountainsides, showing kings and gods and battle scenes. They discovered evidence of a sophisticated culture spread across Anatolia and into Syria. The material evidence kept accumulating, making the skeptical position increasingly untenable. But the fundamental problem remained. Without being able to read the language, scholars couldn't access Hittite history directly. They couldn't know how the Hittites saw themselves, what they valued, how they organized their society. They were stuck interpreting mute stones and incomprehensible tablets, trying to reconstruct a civilization from fragments. The academic debates grew heated. Conferences featured passionate arguments about Hittite chronology, the extent of their empire, their relationship to other powers. Some scholars built elaborate theories on minimal evidence. Others refused to commit to any interpretation until the text could be read. The Hittites became a cause célèbre, a test case for archaeological methodology and historical reconstruction. And through it all, the clay tablets sat in museums and universities, covered in cuneiform marks that might contain answers to every question, if only someone could read them. Letters from kings explaining their decisions, treaties detailing diplomatic negotiations, laws revealing social structures, religious texts describing beliefs and rituals, historical accounts of battles and conquests. It was all there, tantalizingly close, impossibly distant. Some linguists attempted preliminary translations, making guesses based on the few Akkadian words and proper names they could identify. These attempts were largely unsuccessful, producing gibberish or contradictory interpretations. The Hittite language, whatever it was, didn't follow expected patterns. It wasn't Semitic like Akkadian. It wasn't related to the other known languages of the ancient Near East. It was something else entirely. A few scholars suggested it might be Indo-European, related to Greek or Sanskrit or Latin, but this seemed absurd. Indo-European languages were thought to have developed later and further west. Finding one in Bronze Age Anatolia would rewrite assumptions about linguistic migration and development. Most dismissed the idea as speculation, but someone, somewhere, would need to crack the code. The Hittites had left their testimony in clay. They had preserved their history, their laws, their literature. They had done everything possible to be remembered, and now, thousands of years later, their words waited in museum drawers and research libraries, patient and silent. The question wasn't whether the Hittites had been important. The evidence made that increasingly clear. The The question was whether modern scholars were clever enough to recover what the Hittites had tried so hard to preserve, whether genius or luck or stubborn persistence would finally give voice to an empire that had been silent for 3 millennia. The Bible mentioned the Hittites exactly 47 times. Scholars had counted carefully, looking for clues, but those mentions were frustratingly vague. Brief references scattered through the Old Testament, always in passing, never in detail. The Hittites appeared in lists of Canaanite peoples, the various tribes living in the Promised Land before the Israelites arrived. They were mentioned alongside the Jebusites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, groups that warranted perhaps a sentence or two in encyclopedias, minor players in ancient history. Abraham bought a burial cave from Ephron the Hittite. Esau married Hittite women, much to his parents' dismay. King David had Uriah the Hittite in his army, a loyal soldier whom David betrayed and murdered to steal his wife. These were personal stories, individual Hittites appearing in biblical narratives, but they revealed nothing about a larger civilization. They suggested a people living in Canaan, integrated into local society, culturally similar to other small tribal groups. For centuries, that's all anyone thought the Hittites were, a minor Canaanite tribe, biblically significant because they appeared in sacred text, but historically unimportant. Commentators and scholars, writing before the 19th century discoveries in Turkey, described them in dismissive terms. One 18th century biblical encyclopedia devoted exactly 3 sentences to the Hittites, noting simply that they were descendants of Heth, son of Canaan, and had lived somewhere in the region of Hebron. This understanding seemed perfectly reasonable. The biblical text itself gave no indication that the Hittites were special or powerful or extensive. They were just there, part of the landscape, one group among many. Even the conquest narratives, when Joshua led the Israelites into Canaan, treated the Hittites as just another local people to be defeated or absorbed, no more significant than any other. But then archaeologists found Hattusa. They discovered an empire. They uncovered correspondence with pharaohs, and suddenly the biblical references made no sense at all. How could the same people, who ruled a vast empire in Anatolia, who fought Egypt to a standstill, who developed sophisticated laws and technologies, be reduced to a minor tribe in Canaan? How did an empire become a footnote? The contradiction was stark and troubling. Either the Bible was wrong, confusing different peoples who happened to share a name, or the Hittites mentioned in biblical texts were remnants of a much larger civilization, survivors who had migrated south after their empire collapsed. Or perhaps the biblical writers, working centuries after the Hittite Empire fell, had simply forgotten or never known how powerful the Hittites had once been. Conservative biblical scholars, who insisted on the literal accuracy of Scripture, struggled with the disconnect. If the Bible called the Hittites a Canaanite tribe, how could they simultaneously be an Anatolian empire? Some suggested there were 2 different groups, northern Hittites in Anatolia and southern Hittites in Canaan, unrelated despite the shared name. This seemed like special pleading, an attempt to preserve biblical accuracy at the cost of historical coherence. More liberal scholars saw the Hittite discoveries as evidence that biblical texts reflected later traditions, stories written down long after the events they described, by authors who no longer understood the ancient world's political complexities. Perhaps when Genesis and Exodus were compiled, the Hittite Empire had already been forgotten, reduced in folk memory to vague recollections of people called Hittites who once lived in Canaan. The clay tablets from Hattusa offered some resolution. Among the thousands of documents, archaeologists found evidence that the Hittite Empire had indeed controlled territories extending into Syria and the Levant. There were administrative records from Hittite provinces in what would later be Canaan. There were treaties with local rulers. The empire had reached that far south, at least during its height. This suggested a possible answer. The Hittites mentioned in the Bible might be descendants of Hittite colonists or administrators who remained in Canaan after the empire collapsed. They would have retained the name and perhaps some cultural memory, but lost the connection to their imperial past. By the time biblical narratives were set, they were indeed just another local group, their empire long forgotten. But this explanation, while plausible, only deepened the central mystery. How does an empire collapse so completely that its own descendants forget what they were? How does collective memory fail so thoroughly? The Hittites hadn't disappeared overnight. Their cities had burned, yes, but people survived. Refugees must have fled to other regions. Merchants and diplomats and soldiers and scribes must have scattered across the ancient Near East, carrying their language and stories and traditions, and yet within a few generations the memory was gone. The massive stone walls of Hattusa, visible for miles, became ruins without names. The treaties carved on bronze tablets and stored in temples became relics without context. The language, once written and read across an empire, became silent. The kings, who had called themselves great kings and married their daughters to pharaohs, became forgotten. This was the contradiction that haunted scholars. The material evidence said empire, power, sophistication, importance. The historical memory said tribe, minor, forgotten, irrelevant. Both couldn't be true, yet somehow both were. The Hittites had been mighty enough to rival Egypt and insignificant enough to vanish completely. They had been important enough to leave massive archaeological remains, and unimportant enough that no one remembered them. The Bible had preserved the name but lost the context. The stones had preserved the context but lost the voice. Somewhere between the Bronze Age collapse and the biblical compilations, between the burning of Hattusa and the writing of Genesis, an entire civilization had slipped through the cracks of human memory. Not because they were small or weak or peripheral, but despite being strong and extensive and central to their world. This was the deeper revelation. The Hittites weren't just another archaeological discovery. They were proof that history could forget anything, no matter how important. That empires could rise and fall and vanish without trace. That the ancient world was far stranger, far more complex, far more full of lost civilizations than anyone had imagined. And if the Hittites could be forgotten, what else had we lost? By 1915, the Hittites were acknowledged as real, but almost everything else about them remained disputed. The academic community, naturally fractious, divided into camps and sub-camps, each promoting different theories about who the Hittites were, where they came from, and why they mattered. Conferences became battlegrounds, scholarly journals filled with arguments and counter-arguments. Reputations were made and destroyed over interpretations of fragmentary evidence. The first major debate concerned origins. Where had the Hittites come from before they established their empire in Anatolia? One faction, looking at the names of early Hittite kings and the structure of their language, argued they were invaders from the north, Indo-European migrants who swept into Anatolia around 2000 BCE, conquered the existing population, and imposed their rule. This fit broader theories about Indo-European expansion, waves of migration spreading, languages from India to Ireland. But other scholars disagreed. They pointed to evidence of cultural continuity in Anatolia, religious practices and artistic styles that seemed to predate any supposed invasion. Perhaps the Hittites were indigenous to the region, descendants of earlier Anatolian peoples who had gradually developed their civilization over centuries. The Indo-European language might have arrived through trade and cultural contact, not military conquest. Invasion wasn't the only way languages spread. A third group proposed a more complex model, suggesting multiple waves of migration and cultural mixing, Indo-European speakers arriving gradually over centuries, intermarrying with local populations, creating a hybrid culture that was neither purely indigenous nor purely foreign. This theory was probably closest to the truth, though proving it from archaeological evidence alone was nearly impossible. The chronology debates were equally fierce. When exactly had the Hittite Empire risen? When had it fallen? The clay tablets mentioned kings and events, but dating them precisely proved maddeningly difficult. The Bronze Age Near East didn't use a universal calendar. Different kingdoms counted years from different events, and those events themselves were often hard to correlate with modern chronology. Some scholars, working from astronomical references in the tablets, proposed high chronologies that placed key events earlier. Others, emphasizing synchronisms with Egyptian records, argued for lower dates. The difference could be a century or more, which completely changed how Hittite history related to other ancient civilizations. Were the Hittites contemporaries of the Egyptian Old Kingdom or the New Kingdom? The answer mattered for understanding the broader historical context. The question of Hittite power and extent generated perhaps the most heated arguments. Maximalists, looking at the archaeological evidence and the proud claims in Hittite royal inscriptions, argued that the empire at its height rivaled Egypt in size and power, controlling territories from the Aegean to Mesopotamia. They emphasized the military successes, the diplomatic achievements, the cultural sophistication visible in Hittite art and architecture. Minimalists pushed back hard. Royal inscriptions always exaggerated, they noted. Kings claimed to rule territories they barely controlled. The Hittite Empire might have been impressive by Anatolian standards, but still provincial compared to the great civilizations of Egypt and Mesopotamia. Perhaps Hittite power was ephemeral, brief periods of expansion followed by rapid contraction. Perhaps their reputation exceeded their reality. The truth, as usual, lay somewhere in between, but without more evidence, neither side could definitively prove their case. The debate devolved into arguments about methodology, how much to trust royal propaganda, how to interpret archaeological remains, whether absence of evidence meant evidence of absence. Then there was the question of Hittite culture and religion. The tablets, still largely unreadable, clearly contained religious texts. Temples dominated Hattusa's ruins. Rock relief showed gods and goddesses, ceremonies and processions. But what did the Hittites actually believe? Some scholars, noting similarities to Mesopotamian religion, suggested the Hittites were essentially copying Babylonian practices. Others pointed to unique elements, indigenous Anatolian deities, different ritual structures, arguing for a distinct Hittite religious tradition. The few scholars who could puzzle out bits of the religious texts reported strange things: gods with multiple names, elaborate festivals lasting weeks, practices that seemed neither typically Mesopotamian nor typically anything else. The Hittites, it seemed, had absorbed influences from every neighbour, creating a complex religious synthesis that defied easy categorization. Military historians argued about Hittite warfare. The tablets mentioned chariots, lots of chariots, and texts that might be tactical manuals. Were the Hittites military innovators, developing new tactics and technologies? Or were they simply adopting practices from more advanced neighbours? The evidence was contradictory, descriptions of both victories and defeats, innovative strategies and conventional approaches. Economic historians wanted to understand Hittite trade and industry. The tablets contained inventories and contracts, lists of goods and workers. But interpreting these required understanding the language, which meant waiting for the linguistic breakthrough that might never come. In the meantime, scholars made educated guesses based on archaeological remains, storage facilities and workshop areas, evidence of metalworking and textile production. Every conference, every publication, every new excavation season added more questions than answers. The Hittites were emerging from the mist, but they remained frustratingly unclear. A civilization visible but not yet comprehensible. The scholars arguing about them were like blind men describing an elephant, each touching a different part, each convinced they understood the whole. And underneath all these academic debates ran a deeper question that few openly acknowledged. Why did it matter? Why devote careers to understanding a civilization that had failed, that had vanished, that had left no obvious legacy to the modern world? What could the Hittites possibly teach us that Egypt or Greece or Rome couldn't teach better? The answer, for those who cared to look, was precisely in that failure, that vanishing. The Hittites proved that history was contingent, that great civilizations could simply end, that memory was fragile and preservation difficult. They were a warning, wrapped in mystery, buried in Turkish soil, waiting for someone clever enough to make them speak. Bedřich Hrozný was 31 years old, a Czech linguist with a background in ancient Near Eastern languages, when he volunteered for the Austro-Hungarian army in 1914. The Great War swallowed him like it swallowed millions of others, but unlike most, Hrozný carried with him photocopies of Hittite tablets, studying cuneiform marks in trenches between artillery barrages. His obsession with the unknown language didn't pause for war. If anything, the horror around him made the puzzle more essential, a refuge of pure intellectual challenge in a world gone mad. He'd been working on the Hittite problem before the war began, examining copies of tablets from the Hattusa archives, trying approaches that other linguists had abandoned as hopeless. Most scholars assumed Hittite must be related to the known languages of the ancient Near East, some variant of Akkadian or a lost Semitic tongue. But Hrozný suspected something different. The grammar didn't look Semitic. The word structure was wrong. The patterns reminded him of something else entirely. The breakthrough came from a single sentence. Among the thousands of tablet copies, Hrozný found one containing a phrase in what seemed to be archaic Akkadian, followed by the same phrase in Hittite. A bilingual text. the key that had unlocked Egyptian hieroglyphics when scholars found the Rosetta Stone. The Akkadian phrase was simple, a basic statement about bread and eating, and the Hittite version contained a word, new, that reminded Rosny of similar particles in Latin and Greek. It was a hunch, nothing more. But Rosny began working backward from that hunch, assuming Hittite might be Indo-European, related to the ancient languages of Europe and India rather than the Near East. He applied Indo-European grammatical rules to the tablets. He looked for cognates, words that might share roots with Sanskrit or Latin. And slowly, impossibly, the language began to make sense. Water was wada, similar to English water and German Wasser. To eat was edmi, like Latin edere. The word for is was ezi, comparable to Greek esti. These weren't borrowed words or coincidental similarities. They were systematic relationships, the kind that could only exist between languages sharing a common ancestor. Hittite was Indo-European, the oldest Indo-European language ever discovered, preserved in clay thousands of years before Greek or Latin or Sanskrit were written down. Rosny published his initial findings in 1915, in the middle of the war, in a scholarly journal that few people read during those terrible years. His paper was titled The Solution of the Hittite Problem, a bold claim that most linguists initially dismissed. Indo-European languages in Bronze Age Anatolia. The idea seemed absurd, a desperate attempt to find patterns in random noise. But Rosny had done more than identify a few similar-sounding words. He'd worked out grammatical structures, verb conjugations, noun declensions. He could translate whole sentences, producing texts that made sense in context. He published a full grammar in 1917 and then a preliminary dictionary. The translations were rough, full of gaps where vocabulary remained unknown, but they were readable. The Hittite tablets were finally speaking. The academic community responded with a mixture of shock and skepticism. Some scholars embraced Rosny's work immediately, recognizing the rigor of his methodology. Others attacked it viciously, claiming he was seeing relationships that didn't exist, forcing interpretations to fit his theory. The debate raged through journals and conferences complicated by the chaos of war and its aftermath. But Rosny had one crucial advantage. His translations could be tested. Other linguists could take his grammar and dictionary, apply them to untranslated tablets, and see if the results made sense. And gradually, grudgingly, the skeptics were convinced. The translations worked. Hittite really was Indo-European. A Bronze Age civilization in Anatolia had spoken a language ancestral to half of Europe's modern tongues. This revelation transformed everything. It meant Indo-European peoples had been in Anatolia much earlier than anyone thought, which changed theories about migration and cultural development. It meant the Hittites could now be read directly, their history recovered from their own words rather than inferred from archaeology. It meant thousands of tablets could be translated, revealing law codes and treaties, myths and prayers, letters and administrative records. The work proceeded slowly. Rosny's grammar was a start, but Hittite was complex, full of borrowed words from neighbouring languages, using a writing system designed for Akkadian and awkwardly adapted to Indo-European phonology. Professional translators spent years on single tablets, puzzling out vocabulary, debating interpretations, building slowly toward comprehensive understanding. The historical text came first, annals of kings describing their campaigns, year by year, battle by battle. These could be cross-referenced with Egyptian and Mesopotamian records, creating a firm chronology. The names of kings that had been merely guesses could now be read with confidence. Hattusili, Suppiluliuma, Murzili, Muatali. These rulers emerged as distinct personalities with documented deeds. Then came the treaties, and these were revelatory. The Hittites had developed sophisticated diplomatic practices, written agreements with neighbouring kingdoms that specified borders, regulated trade, established mutual defence pacts. The most famous was the treaty between Pharaoh Ramesses II and King Hattusili III, ending decades of conflict between Egypt and Hatti. The same treaty existed in both Egyptian hieroglyphics and Hittite cuneiform, allowing detailed comparison. The law codes were equally impressive, showing a legal system far more advanced than most Bronze Age civilizations. Hittite law emphasized compensation over punishment, required evidence and testimony, protected the rights of the accused, wasn't perfect, certainly not by modern standards, but it was surprisingly sophisticated for 3,200 years ago. Religious texts revealed a complex pantheon, thousands of gods absorbed from conquered peoples and neighbouring cultures. The Hittites had been remarkably tolerant, incorporating local deities rather than destroying them, creating an ever-expanding divine bureaucracy that mirrored their political empire. Their myths mixed Anatolian, Hurrian and Mesopotamian elements, producing unique variations on familiar stories. And slowly, tablet by tablet, translation by translation, the Hittites returned. Not as a vague archaeological mystery, but as a real civilization with documented history, understandable beliefs, recognizable human concerns. They had worried about crops and borders, about succession and betrayal, about pleasing the gods and defeating enemies. They had built and destroyed, loved and hated, triumphed and failed. They had been people, living complicated lives in a complicated world, and now, finally, they could tell their own story. The clay tablets spoke, and what they said was extraordinary. As translators worked through the Hattusa archives in the 1920s and 30s, document after document revealed a civilization far more sophisticated than anyone had imagined. These weren't primitive barbarians. These were skilled administrators running a complex multi-ethnic empire, recording everything with bureaucratic precision that would have impressed any modern government. The archives were organized, that much was clear. Different buildings contained different types of documents. One structure held international correspondence, letters from pharaohs and Babylonian kings, diplomatic negotiations spanning decades. Another contained legal texts, collections of laws and court decisions. A third held religious materials, prayers and rituals and mythological narratives. The Hittites had understood the importance of record-keeping, and they'd done it well. Consider the treaty between Ramesses II and Hattusa III, signed around 1259 BCE after the Battle of Kadesh. The Hittite version, preserved on clay tablets in Hattusa, matched almost exactly the Egyptian version, carved on temple walls at Karnak. Both versions described the same terms, the same borders, the same promises of mutual aid and extradition of refugees. This was the world's first documented international peace treaty, a sophisticated diplomatic instrument that acknowledged both parties as equals. The treaty began with historical preambles, each side's version of events leading to the conflict. It established permanent peace between Egypt and Hatti, defined territorial boundaries in Syria, and created an alliance against external threats. It specified that if either kingdom faced invasion, the other must send military aid. It even included an extradition clause for political refugees, though with protections against torture and execution. This wasn't primitive diplomacy. This was carefully negotiated international law. The legal codes revealed similar sophistication. Hittite law, compiled over centuries and preserved in multiple tablet collections, covered everything from murder to property disputes, from marriage contracts to agricultural regulations. What made it remarkable was its relative modernity and approach. Unlike the Code of Hammurabi, which emphasized retaliation and corporal punishment, Hittite law focused primarily on compensation and restitution. A farmer whose crops were destroyed by someone else's cattle could demand payment equal to the loss. A person injured in an assault could require the attacker to pay medical expenses and lost wages. Even murder could sometimes be settled through compensation to the victim's family, rather than execution, though this depended on circumstances. The law recognized degrees of culpability, distinguishing between accidental and intentional harm, between crimes committed by free citizens and slaves. Women had legal rights unusual for the Bronze Age. They could own property, conduct business, initiate divorce under certain circumstances. Widows retained control of their husbands' estates until sons came of age. The law protected women from being forcibly remarried against their will. It wasn't equality, certainly. Women still had fewer rights than men, but it was remarkably progressive for 3,200 years ago. The administrative texts showed how the empire actually functioned day to day. Inventories listed goods in royal warehouses, grain and oil and wine, textiles and metals and livestock. Work rosters detailed labourers assigned to various projects, building walls or harvesting crops or working in palace workshops. Tax records showed tribute flowing in from subject territories, carefully calculated and meticulously recorded. The Hittites governed through a system of provinces and vassal states. Conquered territories were either annexed directly, governed by Hittite officials, or left semi-independent under local rulers who swore loyalty to the Hittite king. These arrangements were formalized in treaties, copies preserved in both Hattusa and the vassal's capital. The empire was held together by oaths and obligations, backed by military force but maintained through legal and diplomatic structures. Religious texts filled entire archives. The Hittites had hundreds, possibly thousands of gods, accumulated through centuries of conquest and cultural absorption. When they conquered a region, they adopted its gods into their pantheon, giving them temples and priesthoods in Hattusa. This policy of religious tolerance was partly pragmatic, keeping conquered peoples pacified, but it also reflected genuine Hittite belief. They saw divine power as distributed among many gods, each controlling different aspects of existence. The festivals were elaborate, multi-day affairs involving the king personally. Texts described rituals in exhaustive detail, every gesture and prayer specified, every offering listed. The king's role was partly political, partly religious, demonstrating royal authority while maintaining cosmic order. These weren't empty ceremonies. The Hittites believed their survival depended on keeping the gods satisfied through proper ritual. Mythological texts revealed cultural influences from across the Near East. Hittite scribes preserved Hurrian myths, Mesopotamian epics, and indigenous Anatolian stories, sometimes blending them into new narratives. The Kumarbi cycle, a Hurrian myth about generational conflict among the gods, clearly influenced later Greek mythology. The Song of Ulukumi told of a stone giant created to challenge the storm god, a tale that shared themes with Greek stories of the Titans. The historical annals provided detailed accounts of military campaigns, year by year, sometimes battle by battle. These weren't merely propaganda, though they certainly emphasized royal glory. They included accurate geographic information, precise chronologies, acknowledgement of defeats and setbacks alongside victories. Cross-referencing them with Egyptian and Mesopotamian sources confirmed their basic accuracy. King Mursili II's plague prayers, written during a devastating epidemic that killed his father and brother, showed a more personal side of Hittite kingship. Mursili pleaded with the gods to end the plague, offering sacrifices, promising reforms, desperately trying to identify what sin had angered the divine powers. The prayers were heartbreaking, a powerful king reduced to begging, helpless before invisible enemies his armies couldn't fight. The tablets revealed a civilization that was complex and contradictory, sophisticated and brutal, tolerant and expansionist. The Hittites were capable of refined diplomacy and terrible violence, of progressive legal thinking and harsh imperial rule. They were, in other words, recognizably human, neither noble savages nor evil barbarians, but people navigating the challenges of their time with the tools available to them. And all of this, thousands of years of history and culture and human experience, had been buried and forgotten, preserved accidentally when the fires that destroyed Hattusa baked the clay tablets hard enough to survive millennia. The evidence was there, waiting in museum archives, speaking across the centuries to anyone willing to listen. As scholars dug deeper into the translated tablets, they found something unexpected. The Hittites hadn't just been another Bronze Age kingdom fighting over territory and tribute. They'd been innovators, developing technologies and practices that would influence the ancient world for centuries. The evidence was scattered through administrative texts and technical documents, easy to miss if you weren't looking, revolutionary when you understood what you were seeing. The most significant discovery was iron. Not bronze, the copper-tin alloy that gave the age its name, but iron, the metal that would eventually replace bronze throughout the ancient world. The Hittites hadn't invented ironworking. Humans had been smelting small amounts of iron for millennia, but they'd perfected it, developed techniques for producing it reliably and in useful quantities. This wasn't immediately obvious from the tablets. Hittite texts mentioned iron rarely, and when they did, they treated it as precious, sometimes more valuable than gold. A letter from a Hittite king to an Assyrian ruler apologized for sending such a small amount of iron, explaining that it was difficult to produce and supplies were limited. For years, scholars thought iron was simply rare in the Hittite world, mined in small quantities and reserved for ceremonial purposes. But archaeological evidence told a different story. Excavations at Hittite sites found iron tools and weapons, not in huge quantities, but enough to indicate regular production. Analysis of slag heaps revealed sophisticated smelting techniques, methods for achieving the high temperatures needed to extract iron from ore. The Hittites had developed something like industrial production of iron, giving them a significant military and economic advantage. Iron weapons were harder and kept their edge longer than bronze. Iron tools were more durable and could be resharpened repeatedly. And crucially, iron ore was far more abundant than the tin needed for bronze. A kingdom that could produce iron didn't need to import tin from distant sources or worry about disruptions to trade routes. This was strategic independence through technology. The Hittites apparently kept their ironworking techniques secret as long as possible. The diplomatic letters never explained the process. The technical knowledge wasn't written down in the archives, at least not in tablets that survived. It was probably passed down orally, from master craftsmen to apprentices, carefully controlled and protected. When the Hittite Empire collapsed, that knowledge dispersed with the refugees, spreading iron technology throughout the Near East and Mediterranean. The legal system revealed another innovation, concepts that seemed almost modern in their sophistication. The tablets contained what might be the earliest example of constitutional limitations on royal power. Hittite kings, despite their grand titles and absolute authority in theory, were bound by legal traditions and subject to the judgment of a council called the Pancus. The Pancus was composed of nobles and high officials who advised the king and, in some circumstances, could overrule him. Several texts described succession disputes where the Pancus decided which royal claimant should take the throne. Others showed the Pancus forcing kings to reverse decisions or accept restrictions on their authority. This wasn't democracy, certainly, but it was a system of checks and balances unusual for the Bronze Age. The succession laws themselves were remarkably flexible. Unlike Egypt, where pharaohs typically passed power from father to son, Hittite succession could go to sons, brothers, nephews, or even designated non-relatives if the king chose. This prevented the empire from being torn apart by civil wars every generation, though it did create its own problems with rival claimants and political intrigue. The diplomatic practices revealed in the treaties showed another kind of innovation. The Hittites had developed what might be called international relations theory, understanding that stable peace required more than just military dominance. They used royal marriages to create alliances, Hittite princesses marrying foreign kings, foreign princesses marrying into the Hittite royal family. They established trade agreements that benefited both parties. They recognized other great kings as equals, at least formally, avoiding the typical ancient Near Eastern assumption that every king was supreme and all others were vassals. The treaty with Egypt was the culmination of this approach. After decades of conflict, both sides recognized that neither could decisively defeat the other, and that continuing war served neither empire's interests, so they negotiated, compromised, and created a lasting peace that endured for generations. This wasn't weakness. It was sophisticated realpolitik, a pragmatic understanding that power has limits. The religious tolerance mentioned earlier had practical benefits beyond keeping conquered peoples pacified. By incorporating local gods and respecting local religious practices, the Hittites reduced the cost of empire. They didn't need to garrison every province heavily or crush rebellions constantly. The subject peoples had incentives to cooperate, maintaining their traditional ways under Hittite overlordship, rather than facing forced conversion or cultural destruction. But perhaps the deepest mystery was how all of this, the technology and laws and diplomatic sophistication, could simply vanish. When the Hittite Empire collapsed around 1180 BCE, it didn't just fragment into successor states that preserved Hittite traditions, it disappeared almost completely. The capital was abandoned and burned, the bureaucracy dissolved, the diplomatic networks collapsed. Within a few generations, even the memory faded. This wasn't normal. When Rome fell, its legal traditions and cultural practices survived, influencing medieval Europe and beyond. When the Assyrian Empire collapsed, its successor states maintained many Assyrian practices. When Egypt declined, its culture endured for centuries under foreign rule. But the Hittites left almost nothing behind except ruins and buried tablets. Iron technology did spread. That was the Hittites' lasting legacy, though the connection to them was forgotten. Their diplomatic practices might have influenced later Near Eastern kingdoms. Their legal concepts possibly filtered into other legal traditions. But these were indirect inheritances, transmitted without attribution, absorbed into other cultures without acknowledgement. The tablets couldn't explain why. The Hittites didn't write prophecies of their doom or analyses of their empire's weaknesses. They recorded daily administration and diplomacy, treating their civilization as permanent and eternal the way all successful empires do. They couldn't imagine that everything they'd built would crumble, that their sophisticated culture would be reduced to scattered stones and baked clay, waiting 3 millennia for rediscovery. This was the deeper mystery, not just what the Hittites achieved, but why it didn't last, why their innovations didn't spread more widely, why they became so completely forgotten. The answer lay ahead, in the catastrophe that ended their world. The battle that would be remembered for 3,000 years began with bad intelligence and worse judgment. In 1274 BCE, Pharaoh Ramesses II led the Egyptian army north into Syria, confident he could crush the Hittite forces and reclaim territories lost to Hittite expansion. He was young, perhaps 25, eager to prove himself as great as his father and grandfather. The Hittite king Muwatalli II was equally determined to defend his empire's borders. The two armies converged near the city of Kadesh on the Orontes River, and what happened there would change the balance of power in the ancient Near East. Ramesses divided his army into 4 divisions, each named for a major Egyptian god. He led the Amun division personally, pushing ahead aggressively, while the others followed at intervals. This was a tactical mistake, leaving his forces spread out and vulnerable, but Ramesses didn't know it yet. Hittite scouts, disguised as deserters, approached the Egyptian camp with false information. They claimed the Hittite army was far to the north near Aleppo, too distant to threaten the Egyptian advance. Ramesses believed them. This was his second mistake. He pushed forward with just the Amun division, confident that Kadesh was lightly defended and could be taken quickly. His army made camp near the city, began setting up tents and preparing for a siege. The soldiers relaxed, some removing their armour in the afternoon heat, and then the Hittite chariots appeared. Muwatalli had concealed his entire army behind Kadesh, thousands of warriors waiting in silence. His force included not just Hittite soldiers, but contingents from vassal kingdoms across Anatolia and Syria, one of the largest armies ever assembled in the Bronze Age. When the signal came, they attacked. Hittite chariots with 3-man crews, heavier and more powerful than Egyptian 2-man chariots, smashing into the Egyptian camp like a storm. The Amun division broke. Soldiers fled in panic, abandoning weapons and supplies, running south toward where the other divisions were supposed to be approaching. The Egyptian camp descended into chaos. Tents trampled, equipment scattered, commanders shouting orders no one could hear, over the screaming. Ramesses himself, according to later Egyptian accounts, rallied a small force and counterattacked desperately, trying to buy time for reinforcements to arrive. The Hittite victory seemed certain. Egyptian forces were scattered and demoralized. Ramesses was surrounded and fighting for his life. But then something unexpected happened. The Hittite chariot crews, seeing the wealthy Egyptian camp abandoned and undefended, stopped to loot it. Warriors who should have been pursuing fleeing enemies instead rifled through tents, seizing gold and silver, arguing over valuable spoils. Military discipline collapsed into greed. This gave Ramesses the moments he needed. Fresh Egyptian troops arrived, the redivision and elements of the Tar division hitting the scattered Hittite looters from the side. The momentum shifted suddenly. Hittites who'd been celebrating victory found themselves fighting for survival, caught between the Egyptian reinforcements and their own plundered camp. Chariots crashed into each other in confusion. The battlefield became a chaotic melee with no clear lines. Muwatalli, watching from a command post near Kadesh, sent more troops forward, trying to regain control, more chariots, more infantry, pushing the Egyptians back. The battle raged through the afternoon, neither side able to gain decisive advantage. Egyptian troops fought desperately, knowing retreat meant death. Hittite forces attacked in waves, trying to overwhelm the defenders. The carnage was immense, bodies piling up, chariots wrecked, horses screaming. By evening, both armies were exhausted. Ramesses had survived barely, but his forces were badly mauled. The Hittites had inflicted terrible casualties but failed to destroy the Egyptian army completely. Both sides pulled back, neither willing to risk another assault with darkness falling. The battle ended inconclusively, a bloodbath that solved nothing. The aftermath was fascinating, revealing much about ancient Near Eastern politics and propaganda. Ramesses returned to Egypt and immediately began claiming total victory. He commissioned massive inscriptions on temple walls describing how he personally defeated the entire Hittite army, how he fought like a god, how his enemies fled in terror. The Kadesh inscriptions are among the most extensive propaganda documents from ancient Egypt, portraying Ramesses as invincible. But the reality was different. Egypt didn't gain any territory from the battle. Kadesh remained in Hittite hands. The Syrian territories Ramesses had come to reclaim stayed under Hittite control. If this was an Egyptian victory, it was one that left the strategic situation unchanged. The Hittites, for their part, also claimed victory in their own records, though with less bombast. They noted that they'd repelled an Egyptian invasion, defended their territories, and maintained their borders. The truth was that neither side had won. Kadesh was a bloody stalemate, a demonstration that Egypt and Hatti were too evenly matched for either to dominate the other. Both empires possessed vast resources, professional armies, sophisticated tactics. Both had advantages and weaknesses that roughly balanced out. Further warfare would cost both sides enormously without guaranteeing victory for either. This realization, slowly dawning on both Egyptian and Hittite leadership over the following years, would lead to something unprecedented. Two great powers, having fought to exhaustion, would choose peace over endless conflict. They would negotiate, compromise, and create a lasting alliance that changed the nature of international relations in the ancient world. But in 1274 BCE, standing among the corpses near Kadesh, watching the sun set over a battlefield that had settled nothing, neither Ramesses nor Muwatalli could yet imagine that outcome. They had fought the decisive battle that ended indecisively, the turning point that turned nothing, the confrontation that proved confrontation was futile. The Battle of Kadesh didn't end the Egyptian-Hittite rivalry, but it began the process that eventually would, transforming enemies into allies, creating the ancient world's first great peace treaty, and establishing diplomatic precedents that would echo through millennia. The blood spilled near the Orontes River brought a hard lesson that sometimes the only way to win is to stop fighting. The years after Kadesh were strange ones, a twilight period where Egypt and Hatti remained technically at war but fought no major battles. Both empires pulled back, nursing wounds, rebuilding armies, watching each other warily across the Syrian buffer zone. Ramesses continued his propaganda campaign, covering Egypt with inscriptions proclaiming his heroic victory. The Hittites quietly reinforced their borders and strengthened alliances with vassal states. Neither side wanted another Kadesh. Muwatalli died around 1272 BCE, perhaps from illness, perhaps from wounds sustained in battle. The records are unclear. His brother Hattusili eventually seized the throne after a brief succession dispute, pushing aside Muwatalli's son. This internal conflict weakened Hatti temporarily, giving Egypt opportunities to probe Hittite defences. But Hattusili proved a capable ruler, consolidating power quickly and turning his attention to the Egyptian problem. He understood what Muwatalli might not have fully grasped. Continued conflict with Egypt was unsustainable. The Battle of Kadesh had demonstrated that neither empire could decisively defeat the other without catastrophic costs. Meanwhile, new threats were emerging that should concern both powers far more than their mutual rivalry. Assyria was growing stronger to the east, eyeing territories both Egypt and Hatti considered their spheres of influence. Tribal movements in the north and west threatened Hittite Anatolia. Hattusili began making diplomatic overtures, not immediately, not obviously, but through careful channels. Letters exchanged between courts, discussing minor issues, establishing communication. The tone shifted gradually from hostile to formal to almost cordial. Both sides began acknowledging realities they'd previously denied. Egypt couldn't conquer Syria without massive, perhaps impossible military investment. Hatti couldn't push into Egyptian territories without similar costs. The current borders, established through blood and iron, were probably permanent. Around 1259 BCE, 15 years after Kadesh, the negotiations became serious. Egyptian and Hittite diplomats met somewhere in Syria, probably in neutral territory, to discuss terms. The meetings lasted months, every phrase debated, every clause examined for potential exploitation. Both sides wanted peace, but neither wanted to appear weak or desperate. The final treaty had to satisfy domestic audiences in both empires while creating genuine, lasting stability. The result was remarkable. The Egyptian-Hittite peace treaty established formal borders, recognized each empire's territorial integrity, and created a mutual defense pact against external threats. If Assyria attacked Egypt, Hatti would send military aid. If northern tribes invaded Hatti, Egypt would support them. The treaty even included provisions for extraditing political refugees, though with protections against torture and capital punishment. But the treaty was more than just practical politics. It represented a philosophical shift in how great powers related to each other. Previous diplomatic agreements in the ancient Near East typically involved a superior power dictating terms to an inferior one. Kings claimed universal dominion, insisting that all other rulers were their vassals, whether or not this was actually true. The Egyptian-Hittite treaty was different. It acknowledged explicitly that both parties were equals, both were great kings, both deserved respect and recognition. The language was carefully balanced. The Egyptian version, carved on temple walls at Karnak, phrased certain passages to emphasize Egyptian dignity and honor. The Hittite version, written on clay tablets stored in Hattusa, emphasized Hittite strength and legitimacy. But the substance was identical. Both versions committed to the same borders, the same alliance, the same peaceful coexistence. Neither side could later claim they'd been deceived, or that the other had agreed to different terms. To seal the alliance, Hattusili sent his daughter to Egypt to marry Ramesses. This wasn't unusual. Royal marriages had long been used to cement diplomatic relationships, but the ceremony and propaganda surrounding it revealed how seriously both sides took the peace. Ramesses commissioned inscriptions describing the Hittite princess's arrival, how she brought peace between the two lands, how the gods themselves rejoiced at the alliance. Hattusili wrote to Ramesses addressing him as brother, a title of respect between equals. The peace held. For the remaining decades of Ramesses' long reign, more than 50 years on the throne, Egypt and Hatti maintained their alliance. They coordinated responses to Assyrian expansion. They facilitated trade that benefited both empires. They exchanged letters discussing everything from medicine to building projects to personal family matters. The great rivalry that had consumed so much blood and treasure ended not with conquest but with recognition of mutual interest. This had profound consequences for the ancient Near East. The Egyptian-Hittite alliance created stability across the region, allowing both empires to focus on internal development and external threats rather than fighting each other. Trade flourished when merchants could cross borders without fear of war-disrupting routes. Cultural exchange increased, ideas and technologies spreading between Egypt and Anatolia. The treaty became a model for later diplomatic agreements. Its structure, its language, its conceptual framework of peace between equals, all of this influenced subsequent treaties throughout the ancient world. When later kingdoms negotiated peace, they looked to the Egyptian-Hittite treaty as precedent. The idea that great powers could coexist without one dominating the other, revolutionary in the 13th century BCE, became gradually normalized. But there was also something tragic in this peace. The fact that it took 15 years and countless deaths to reach an agreement that both sides could have accepted before Kadesh revealed the limitations of Bronze Age diplomacy. The battle had been unnecessary. The bloodshed had achieved nothing except proving that more bloodshed would be equally futile. Thousands had died to learn a lesson that wiser leadership might have understood without fighting. Still, the peace stood as an achievement. Two empires that had been enemies became allies. The Nile and the Anatolian highlands, separated by hundreds of miles and profound cultural differences, were connected by mutual recognition and shared interest. For a brief moment in the Bronze Age before the catastrophes to come, Egypt and Hatti showed that there were alternatives to endless war, that diplomacy could succeed where force had failed, that even ancient enemies could find common ground. The treaty tablets sat in the archives at Hattusa, carefully preserved, proof that peace was possible. They would remain there, buried and forgotten, until modern archaeologists found them 3,000 years later and realized they were reading the world's first great peace agreement. The Hittites left fingerprints on history, even if the hand that made them was forgotten. Walk through the ruins of their civilization, and you find innovations, practices, and ideas that echoed through millennia. influencing cultures that never knew the Hittites existed. The empire disappeared, but pieces of what they created survived, woven into the fabric of later civilizations so thoroughly that the source became invisible. Iron was the most obvious legacy. When the Hittite Empire collapsed around 1180 BCE, the ironworking secrets they'd guarded dispersed with the refugees and craftsmen fleeing the destruction. Hittite metalworkers settled in new kingdoms, bringing their knowledge with them. Within a few generations, iron production spread throughout the Near East and Mediterranean. The Iron Age began not through independent invention, but through the diffusion of Hittite technology. This changed everything. Iron tools meant farmers could clear land more efficiently, plough harder soils, produce more food. Iron weapons meant smaller kingdoms could equip armies without depending on the scarce tin imports for bronze. The democratization of military technology helped end the Bronze Age palace economies and contributed to the rise of new political structures. None of this was intentional Hittite influence. It was an accident of collapse, knowledge spreading because it could no longer be contained. The diplomatic practices established in the Egyptian-Hittite treaty became templates for later agreements. When Assyrian kings negotiated with Babylonian rulers, when Persian emperors dealt with Greek city-states, when Hellenistic kingdoms divided Alexander's empire, they used treaty structures and diplomatic language that echoed Hittite precedents. The concept of negotiated peace between equals, revolutionary when Hattusilian Ramesses embraced it, became standard international practice. The legal concepts preserved in Hittite law codes influenced neighbouring cultures through complex pathways. Legal ideas travelled with merchants and scribes, with conquered peoples and conquering armies. The emphasis on compensation over punishment, the recognition of degrees of culpability, the protections for the accused. These concepts appeared later in other Near Eastern legal traditions. Proving direct influence is difficult, but the similarities are striking. Biblical law, compiled centuries after the Hittite Empire fell, shows possible Hittite influence. The structure of biblical covenant texts resembles Hittite treaty formats, with historical preambles, stipulations, and blessings and curses. Scholars debate whether this represents direct borrowing or simply common ancient Near Eastern practice. But the Hittites were among the first to formalize these structures. Their treaty templates may have influenced the very way biblical writers conceived of the relationship between God and Israel. The religious tolerance the Hittites practiced, incorporating conquered peoples' gods rather than destroying them, became a model for later empires. The Persians adopted similar policies, allowing subject peoples to maintain traditional religions while owing political loyalty to the empire. Alexander continued this approach. Rome eventually perfected it, creating a vast multi-ethnic, multi-religious empire held together partly by respecting local traditions. The Hittite precedent that religious tolerance made empire cheaper and more stable proved remarkably durable. Greek mythology shows traces of Hittite influence, transmitted through Anatolian and Syrian intermediaries. The succession myth in Hesiod's Theogony, where younger gods overthrow older ones in generational conflict, closely parallels the Hittite Kumabi cycle. The monsters and divine battles, the castration of sky gods, the themes of cosmic succession all appear in both traditions. Greek poets probably never knew they were borrowing from Hittite sources. The stories had been filtered through so many retellings that origins were obscured. The chariot warfare tactics perfected by the Hittites influenced military practice throughout the Bronze and early Iron Ages. The heavy three-man chariot with driver, warrior, and shield-bearer became standard in Near Eastern armies. The use of chariots in coordinated mass attacks, the integration of chariot forces with infantry, the training regimens for horses and crews all showed Hittite influence. When David fought Goliath, when Assyrian armies conquered the Near East, when Persian forces invaded Greece, they used tactics the Hittites had pioneered. But perhaps the deepest impact was philosophical, a lesson about the fragility of civilizations. The Hittites proved that empires could vanish completely, that power and wealth and cultural achievement offered no guarantee of remembrance. This knowledge, once the Hittites were rediscovered, changed how modern scholars understood history. The past was revealed as darker, more full of gaps and losses than previously imagined. Archaeology itself was transformed by the Hittite discoveries. The realization that major civilizations could be completely forgotten motivated more careful excavation, more systematic record-keeping, more serious attention to Bronze Age sites that classical scholars had dismissed as unimportant. The search for other lost civilizations intensified. If the Hittites could be forgotten, what else might be buried and waiting? The decipherment of Hittite, revealing it as Indo-European, revolutionized linguistic studies. It pushed back the documented history of Indo-European languages by over 1,000 years. It proved that Indo-European speakers had been in Anatolia much earlier than previously thought, which changed theories about Indo-European origins and migration. Every Indo-European language, from English to Hindi, from Russian to Spanish, had a newly discovered ancient cousin. Modern international law owes something to the Hittites, though the debt is rarely acknowledged. The Egyptian-Hittite Treaty, with its carefully balanced language, its mutual obligations, its recognition of sovereign equality, established principles that resonate in modern diplomacy. The United Nations, the Geneva Conventions, the complex web of international treaties that structure our globalized world, all rest partly on foundations the Hittites helped establish 33 centuries ago. And there's something inspiring in that. The idea that innovations created in the Bronze Age still matter, that the Hittites' work wasn't entirely lost even when their name was forgotten. Iron and treaties, legal concepts and diplomatic practices, mythology and military tactics, these threads connected the Hittite past to our present. The empire fell, the cities burned, the language died. But pieces survived, small fragments of achievements scattered through history. The Hittites shaped our world more than they knew, more than we usually recognize. Their legacy wasn't in monuments that endured or texts that were continuously read. It was in ideas and practices that spread so widely they became universal, roots so deep no one remembered where they originally grew. The forgotten empire left behind a forgotten influence, powerful precisely because it was invisible. The clay tablets preserved something extraordinary, not just history and laws and treaties, but actual human voices. Kings and queens speaking across millennia, not as distant figures carved in stone, but as recognizable people, with hopes and fears, anger and love, petty grievances and profound concerns. Read the tablets carefully, and the Hittites stop being archaeological artifacts. They become human. Queen Puduhepa wrote hundreds of letters that survived in the Hattusa archives. She was the wife of King Hattusili III, but she wasn't merely a consort. She governed alongside her husband, conducting her own diplomatic correspondence, negotiating treaties, managing religious affairs. Her letters to the Egyptian court reveal a sharp political mind and a personality that refused to accept subordination. When the Egyptian queen wrote to her with what Puduhepa considered insufficient respect, addressing her as if she were merely a king's wife rather than a ruler in her own right, Puduhepa responded with barely controlled anger. She pointed out her own royal lineage, her role in government, her authority over religious matters. She demanded the respect due to her position. The letter crackled with wounded dignity and assertiveness, a woman insisting on recognition in a world dominated by men. Puduhepa's religious devotion filled other tablets. She wrote prayers to the sun goddess of Arina, pleading for the health of her family, the prosperity of the empire, the success of diplomatic missions. These weren't formal liturgies but personal communications, intimate conversations with the divine. She bargained with the gods, promised offerings in exchange for favours, asked for signs and guidance. Her faith was practical and transactional, but also deeply felt. King Masili II left behind some of the most emotionally raw texts from the ancient world. His plague prayers, written during a devastating epidemic that killed thousands, including his own father and brother, are heartbreaking in their desperation. Masili begged the gods to explain what sin had brought this catastrophe, what he or his father had done to deserve such punishment. He promised anything, reforms and offerings and penances, if only the gods would end the suffering. The prayers reveal Masili's guilt and confusion. He wondered if his father had violated an oath, angering the gods. He worried that he himself had failed in some ritual obligation. He searched desperately for meaning in disaster, trying to understand why the gods would destroy so many innocent people. The theology was Bronze Age, the assumption that disease reflected divine anger. But the emotion was universal, a leader overwhelmed by crisis, grasping for explanations, trying to protect people he couldn't save. Other tablets preserved more mundane concerns. Administrative records listed workers assigned to various tasks, their rations and wages, complaints about unfair treatment. One text recorded a labour dispute, workers demanding better conditions, officials negotiating compromises. Another documented a merchant's lawsuit over a business deal gone wrong, the merchant arguing his case with lawyerly precision, citing precedents and demanding compensation. Letters between kings and officials showed the daily frustrations of governance. A provincial governor wrote to the king complaining about inadequate military support, border regions threatened by raiders, local authorities unable to maintain order without reinforcements. The king's response was bureaucratic, promising to look into the matter, explaining budgetary constraints, suggesting the governor make do with existing resources. The exchange could have been written yesterday. Royal family dramas emerge from the tablets too. Succession disputes, brothers competing for the throne, queens manoeuvring to advance their sons, kings trying to maintain peace among competing heirs. One remarkable text showed King Hattusa I near death, publicly disowning his nephew whom he'd designated as successor, declaring the young man unworthy and naming his grandson instead. The speech was bitter, listing the nephew's failures and betrayals, expressing profound disappointment in someone he'd trusted and loved. A tablet preserved a letter from a Hittite prince studying in Egypt, writing home to his mother. He complained about the heat, the strange food, the difficulty of learning Egyptian language and customs. He was homesick and lonely, missing the mountains of Anatolia, asking when he could return. His mother's response, found in the same archive, was affectionate but firm. He needed to finish his education, learn Egyptian ways, make connections that would benefit the empire. She sympathized but offered no immediate rescue. The tablets recorded marriages and divorces, property transfers and inheritances, debts and payments. They showed people buying and selling, borrowing and lending, getting into legal trouble and extracting themselves. A woman sued for divorce, claiming her husband was abusive and neglectful. A merchant declared bankruptcy, his creditors fighting over remaining assets. A priest was accused of embezzling temple funds and defended himself with detailed accounting records. Military documents revealed soldiers' lives. Rosters listed names and units, origins and specialties. Some men were professional warriors serving for years, advancing through ranks. Others were conscripts, farmers and labourers pulled into service during campaigns, eager to return home. Casualty lists documented those who died in battle or from disease, names carefully recorded so families could be notified and death benefits paid. Even slaves appeared as individuals rather than statistics. Some tablets recorded their purchase and sale, but others showed them making legal complaints, testifying in court, occasionally winning freedom through long service or special merit. The law protected them from certain abuses, required masters to provide adequate food and shelter, allowed them to own small amounts of property. Slavery was still brutal and unjust, but the tablets revealed it as a complex institution with regulations and protections. What emerges from these texts is a society that was hierarchical and often harsh, but also surprisingly organized and legally sophisticated. People had rights, even if those rights varied by status. Justice was supposed to follow procedures, even if the powerful sometimes evaded them. Life was hard but not entirely hopeless, governed by laws that at least attempted fairness. The Hittites were people like us, navigating their world with the tools available to them. They loved and hated, feared and hoped, succeeded and failed. They worried about their children's futures and their parents' health. They argued over money and status and respect. They tried to make sense of suffering and find meaning in achievement. And they left their voices in clay, never imagining that 3,000 years later, strangers would read their words and recognize their humanity. The Hittite Empire wasn't built through consent. It was forged through conquest, maintained by force, and constantly challenged by those it claimed to rule. The tablets preserve not just the empire's triumphs but also its struggles, the endless rebellions and resistance movements that tested Hittite power from the empire's founding until its final collapse. Every expansion created new enemies. Every conquered territory harboured resentment waiting to erupt. The Kaska people of northern Anatolia were the Hittites' most persistent threat. They lived in the mountainous regions beyond Hittite control, fiercely independent tribes who refused to accept imperial authority. They raided Hittite territories constantly, burning farms, seizing livestock, attacking isolated settlements. Hittite armies campaigned against them repeatedly, but the Kaska simply retreated into the mountains, waited for the soldiers to leave, then resumed raiding. The conflict lasted centuries. Hittite kings built fortresses along the northern frontier, garrisoned troops permanently, tried to establish buffer zones between the empire and the Kaska lands. Nothing worked permanently. The Kaska were too mobile, too familiar with the terrain, too committed to their independence. Several Hittite kings died fighting them. Others simply accepted that the northern border would never be truly secure. The tablets recorded Kaska attacks with weary frustration. One military report described a massive raid that penetrated deep into Hittite territory, reaching nearly to Hattusa itself before being driven back. Another documented the loss of several border fortresses, their garrisons overwhelmed, the survivors fleeing south with tales of Kaska ferocity. The Kaska became a permanent drain on Hittite resources, a problem that couldn't be solved, only managed. Syria presented different challenges. The wealthy cities of the Syrian coast and interior had their own ancient traditions, their own gods and customs, their own sense of identity distinct from Anatolian culture. When the Hittites conquered them, these cities submitted because they had no choice, but they never truly accepted Hittite rule. They paid tribute while plotting rebellion, professed loyalty while negotiating with Egypt or Mitanni. The tablets preserved evidence of constant Syrian intrigue. City rulers wrote obsequious letters to the Hittite king while secretly corresponding with his enemies. Merchants facilitated communications between rebel factions. Religious leaders used their influence to maintain Syrian cultural identity and resist Hittite assimilation. Whenever the empire showed weakness, Syria erupted in rebellion. King Suppiluliuma thus spent much of his reign campaigning in Syria, crushing revolts, replacing unreliable local rulers with loyal ones, establishing tighter Hittite control. He was largely successful, but the underlying resentment remained. His successors faced new rebellions, new conspiracies, new attempts to break free from Hittite domination. Syria was profitable, controlling vital trade routes and productive agricultural land, but it was never secure. Internal opposition came from Hittite nobles who resented royal authority or felt passed over for positions and honours. The succession crises mentioned earlier often involved aristocratic factions supporting rival claimants. When King Hattusa III seized the throne from his nephew Urhi-Teshub, he justified the coup by claiming Urhi-Teshub had been incompetent and had lost the support of the gods and the people. But the reality was a power struggle, one faction of nobles backing Hattusa against another supporting Urhi-Teshub. The Pankus, that council of nobles that theoretically limited royal power, could be a source of opposition when kings pushed too hard or made unpopular decisions. Several tablets described conflicts between kings and the Pankas, disputes over policy or appointments, struggles over who actually controlled the empire, the system of checks, and balances that prevented absolute royal tyranny also created opportunities for aristocratic resistance. Religious authorities occasionally challenged royal policies too. The Hittite king was supposed to be the chief priest, maintaining proper relationships with the gods through correct ritual observance. But the actual religious bureaucracy, the priests and priestesses who managed temples and conducted daily ceremonies, had their own sources of power and authority. When kings tried to reform religious practices or redirect temple resources, they faced pushback from entrenched religious institutions. One remarkable text described a king's struggle with the priesthood over temple lands. The king wanted to redistribute some temple property to reward military officers, arguing that the temples had more land than they needed. The priest resisted, claiming the land was sacred, dedicated to the gods, and couldn't be alienated. The dispute dragged on for years, neither side willing to compromise until finally the king backed down, unwilling to risk religious conflict on top of his other problems. The empire's subject peoples, those conquered kingdoms and cities that maintained nominal independence under Hittite overlordship, resisted in more subtle ways. They complied with treaty obligations when Hittite armies were nearby, but neglected them when attention was elsewhere. They provided the minimum required tribute rather than the amount specified in treaties. They dragged their feet on military support, sending fewer soldiers than demanded, or holding them back from dangerous assignments. Vassal rulers corresponded with each other, forming networks of mutual support sometimes coordinating resistance. They played the great powers against each other, Egypt versus Hatti, Assyria versus Hatti, whoever offered the best terms for switching allegiance. Loyalty was transactional, maintained only as long as Hittite power made rebellion seem foolish. When the empire weakened, vassals defected immediately. The tablets preserved letters from Hittite kings trying to maintain these complex relationships, angry demands that vassals fulfill their obligations, threats of military action if tribute wasn't paid, pleas for loyalty when external threats emerged, promises of rewards for faithful service. The correspondence revealed the constant effort required to hold an empire together, the endless negotiations and threats and compromises needed to prevent collapse. Opposition wasn't futile. Rebels sometimes succeeded, at least temporarily. Cities won their independence, held it for years or decades before being reconquered. The Kaska captured significant territories and held them. Vassal states switched allegiance and prospered under new masters. Even within the Hittite royal family, rebellious princes occasionally won succession struggles and claimed the throne. But opposition was also dangerous. Failed rebellions brought terrible retribution. The tablets described cities destroyed, populations enslaved, rebel leaders publicly executed. The Hittites could be pragmatic and tolerant when it served their interests, but they could also be ruthlessly violent when necessary. The empire survived as long as it did partly through sophisticated diplomacy and partly through demonstrated willingness to crush resistance without mercy. These resistant voices, preserved in administrative records and military reports, complicate the story of Hittite power. The empire wasn't an inevitable success story. It was a constant struggle against enemies external and internal, against geography and distance, against the basic human desire for autonomy and self-determination. That it lasted 5 centuries was remarkable. That it eventually collapsed was perhaps inevitable. The reign of Suppiluliuma III, beginning around 1344 BCE, marked the Hittite Empire's golden age, the moment when military power and cultural achievement reached their peak. This wasn't the empire's founding that had happened centuries earlier, but it was the empire's awakening to its full potential, the realization of what Hittite civilization could become when everything aligned, when great leadership combined with favorable circumstances to produce something extraordinary. Suppiluliuma inherited a troubled kingdom. His father and grandfather had struggled with rebellions in Syria, incursions from the Kaska in the north, competition with Mitanni to the east. The empire was wealthy and powerful, but also overstretched and vulnerable. Young Suppiluliuma, perhaps 25 when he took the throne, was expected to manage decline, maintain what his predecessors had built, perhaps reign competently if not brilliantly. Instead, he transformed the empire. His military campaigns conquered territories from the Aegean to the Euphrates, crushing the kingdom of Mitanni and establishing Hittite hegemony across the northern Near East. He negotiated the diplomatic balance that allowed the Hittites to expand without triggering fatal conflict with Egypt or Assyria. He reorganized the imperial administration, creating more efficient bureaucracies and better integrated provincial governance, and he presided over a cultural flowering that made Hattusa a center of learning and artistic achievement. The military successes came first and enabled everything else. Suppiluliuma campaigned in Syria with devastating effectiveness, defeating coalition armies, capturing fortified cities, replacing hostile rulers with loyal vassals. Where previous kings had fought endless inconclusive wars, Suppiluliuma won decisively, broke enemy resistance so thoroughly that conquered territories accepted Hittite rule as permanent. The defeat of Mitanni was his masterpiece. That kingdom, once Egypt's ally and the Hittites' greatest rival, collapsed under Suppiluliuma's attacks, its territories absorbed into the Hittite sphere, its king reduced to a powerless figurehead, the victory eliminated the main threat to Hittite dominance in Syria, and shifted the balance of power throughout the region. Egypt now faced a Hittite empire that controlled everything from Anatolia to northern Mesopotamia. But Suppiluliuma understood that conquest alone didn't create lasting empire. He invested heavily in administration, establishing provincial capitals with proper bureaucracies, appointing capable governors, creating systems for tax collection and dispute resolution. He regularized treaty relationships with vassal states, establishing clear obligations and rewards, making Hittite overlordship predictable and bearable, rather than arbitrary and oppressive. The cultural achievements of his reign were equally impressive. Hattusa expanded dramatically, new temples and palaces rising within the massive stone walls, residential quarters spreading across the hillsides. The archives grew as scribes produced unprecedented numbers of tablets, documenting everything from royal annals to religious rituals, from legal decisions to diplomatic correspondence. The city became one of the Bronze Age's great capitals, rivaling Thebes or Babylon in monumentality. Religious life flourished under royal patronage. Suppiluliuma funded temple construction throughout the empire, not just in Hattusa but in provincial centres too. He incorporated conquered peoples' gods into the Hittite pantheon systematically, giving them proper shrines and priesthoods, showing respect for local traditions while asserting Hittite control. The religious tolerance that became characteristic of the empire reached its fullest expression during his reign. Literature and scholarship developed in new directions. Scribes translated foreign texts into Hittite, Mesopotamian epics and Hurrian myths becoming part of Hittite literary culture. They compiled legal precedents into systematic codes, creating comprehensive law collections that later kings would use and expand. They preserved historical records with increasing sophistication, moving from simple annals to more analytical accounts that explained motivations and consequences. Artistic production achieved new heights. Stone reliefs carved during Suppiluliuma's reign showed technical mastery and aesthetic sophistication comparable to anything produced in Egypt or Mesopotamia. The Lion Gate at Hattusa, with its massive carved guardians, demonstrated Hittite sculptural achievement. Rock reliefs at provincial sites displayed royal power and divine favour in compositions that were both politically effective and artistically impressive. The diplomatic correspondence from this period revealed a kingdom confident in its power, but also pragmatic in its approach to international relations. Suppiluliuma negotiated with Egypt as an equal, exchanged letters with Assyrian and Babylonian kings that were respectful while asserting Hittite interests, managed complex relationships with dozens of vassal states. He understood that the empire's size and diversity required sophisticated diplomacy alongside military strength. But perhaps most importantly, Suppiluliuma created the conditions for cultural synthesis. The Hittite Empire under his rule became a melting pot, where Anatolian, Hurrian, Syrian, and Mesopotamian traditions mixed and influenced each other. Scribes working in Hattusa came from diverse backgrounds, bringing different perspectives and knowledge. Merchants trading across the empire facilitated exchange of ideas alongside goods. The cosmopolitan character that marked Hittite civilization at its height emerged during Suppiluliuma's reign. This cultural awakening wasn't just elite. Archaeological evidence shows increasing prosperity across Hittite territories during this period, improvements in agricultural productivity, expansion of craft production, growth in trade. Common people benefited from imperial stability and wealth, even if they bore the burdens of taxation and military service. The empire worked, delivering enough security and prosperity that most subject peoples accepted their place within it. The tablets from Suppiluliuma's reign convey a sense of confidence and achievement, a civilization that believed in its own greatness and its future permanence. The king's titles grew more elaborate, claiming universal dominion, asserting divine favour. The religious festivals became more elaborate, lasting weeks, involving the king personally in ceremonies that demonstrated the proper cosmic order. Everything about Hittite culture during this period projected power and sophistication, yet there was also fragility beneath the magnificence. The empire's success depended heavily on Suppiluliuma personally, his strategic vision and leadership. When he died, probably from plague contracted during a Syrian campaign, his successors inherited his achievements, but not necessarily his abilities. The empire remained powerful, but the creative energy that had driven its awakening gradually dissipated. Still, for those few decades of Suppiluliuma's reign, the Hittites achieved something remarkable. They built an empire that was militarily powerful but also culturally sophisticated, administratively competent, religiously tolerant. They created a cosmopolitan civilization that absorbed influences from every direction while maintaining distinct Hittite identity. They proved that Anatolia could be the centre of a great power, not merely a periphery of more important civilizations. This was the Hittite Empire at its peak, the moment before the long decline, the achievement that would be forgotten but deserved to be remembered. The end came suddenly, catastrophically, mysteriously. Around 1180 BCE, the Hittite Empire collapsed. Not slowly, not through gradual decline and absorption by rivals, but in a violent explosion that destroyed the political structure, burned the cities, shattered the administrative apparatus, and scattered the population. Within a single generation, the empire that had lasted 5 centuries simply ceased to exist, and the mystery of how and why this happened reveals something profound about the fragility of Bronze Age civilization. The tablets preserved at Hattusa stop abruptly. There's no final chronicle describing the empire's death, no king's desperate last message, no administrative record showing systemic collapse. The archive simply ends, frozen in a moment sometime in the late 13th or early 12th century BCE. After that, silence. The city burned, was abandoned, and wasn't reoccupied. The Hittite state vanished. For decades, scholars blamed the mysterious sea peoples, maritime raiders mentioned in Egyptian sources who attacked the eastern Mediterranean around this time. The theory was appealing, invading barbarians sweeping through the civilized world, destroying everything in their path. It explained the violence and suddenness of the collapse. But it didn't explain much else. Who were these sea peoples? Where did they come from? Why did they attack? And why did the Hittite Empire, militarily powerful and administratively sophisticated, fall so completely to raiders who left no lasting state of their own? The archaeological evidence complicated simple invasion narratives. Yes, Hittite cities burned. Yes, there was violence and destruction. But the pattern was strange. Some cities were abandoned before being destroyed, their populations fleeing, leaving valuable goods behind. Others showed signs of internal collapse, breakdown of civic order, before any external attack. The destruction looked less like coordinated military conquest and more like civilizational implosion. Climate data revealed another piece of the puzzle. Around 1200 BCE, the eastern Mediterranean experienced severe drought, years of reduced rainfall, failed harvests, widespread famine. Tree ring analysis confirmed this, showing narrow growth rings indicating water stress. The drought lasted decades, long enough to destabilize agricultural economies that Bronze Age civilizations depended on. Hungry people became desperate people, triggering migration, conflict, and social breakdown. But drought alone doesn't explain the collapse either. Civilizations had survived droughts before through stored grain reserves, through trade that imported food from unaffected regions, through administrative capacity to distribute resources and maintain order. The Bronze Age kingdoms had sophisticated bureaucracies precisely for managing such crises. Why did they fail so completely this time? The deepest truth may be that Bronze Age civilization was more fragile than it appeared. The great empires, for all their power and sophistication, rested on complex interdependent systems that worked brilliantly when conditions were favourable, but collapsed catastrophically when those conditions changed. The Hittites depended on tin imports from distant sources for bronze production. They relied on grain from specific agricultural regions to feed their cities. They needed trade networks functioning smoothly to move goods across their empire. When drought disrupted agricultural production, food shortages strained social cohesion. When desperate populations migrated seeking survival, they disrupted trade routes and threatened borders. When trade networks broke down, tin stopped flowing, bronze production declined, military power weakened. When military power weakened, vassals rebelled, enemies attacked, empire fragmented. Each element of the system depended on others, and when one failed, cascading failures followed. The sea peoples may have been symptoms rather than causes. Displaced populations fleeing their own drought-stricken homelands, becoming raiders because raiding was the only way to survive. Their attacks didn't create the crisis so much as exploit it, hitting kingdoms already weakened by internal problems. The Hittites couldn't defeat them, not because the attackers were especially powerful, but because Hittite power had already eroded from within. There's evidence of political dysfunction in the empire's final decades. Succession disputes weakened royal authority. Provincial governors acted increasingly independently. Vassal states neglected treaty obligations or switched allegiance. The administrative system, so effective under strong kings, struggled under weaker leadership during crisis conditions. The empire required competent coordination to function, and that coordination was breaking down. The cities burned. But who burned them? External invaders certainly in some cases, internal rebels in others, sometimes probably the inhabitants themselves, desperate people destroying what they were abandoning so enemies couldn't use it. The archaeology shows violence, but not clearly who committed it or why. The confusion itself is revealing, society breaking down so completely that normal patterns of conquest and occupation didn't apply. What's certain is that the collapse was nearly total across the eastern Mediterranean. Egypt survived but severely weakened, losing its empire and entering a dark age. The Mycenaean palaces in Greece burned and weren't rebuilt. The great cities of Syria and the Levant were destroyed. Trade networks collapsed. Literacy declined or disappeared in many regions. The interconnected Bronze Age world system simply stopped functioning. The Hittites weren't uniquely vulnerable. They were simply part of a broader system, and when that system failed, they failed with it. Their empire was the most thoroughly destroyed, possibly because it was most dependent on the system's continued functioning, possibly simply because they were unlucky. Within 2 generations of the collapse, Hittite cities were ruins, their language was dead, their history was being forgotten. This is the revelation that haunts modern scholars. Civilization is always more fragile than it appears. Complex systems can function beautifully for centuries, then collapse within years when conditions change. Power and sophistication offer no protection against systemic failure. The Hittites did everything right, built a great empire, developed sophisticated institutions, achieved cultural flowering. And it didn't save them. The clay tablets, baked hard by the fires that destroyed Hattusa, preserved this truth. A civilization wrote its own records meticulously, documented its achievements, planned for eternal glory. And then it ended, suddenly and completely, leaving only ruins and baked clay to whisper that nothing lasts forever, that every empire contains the seeds of its own destruction, that remembrance requires more than monuments and archives. The Hittites couldn't imagine their complete disappearance. Neither can we imagine ours. But the ruins at Hattusa testify that empires fall, civilizations vanish, and memory itself is fragile. This is the deepest truth the Hittites teach us across 3 millennia, not through their strength, but through their catastrophic failure. Stand in the ruins of Hattusa today, and you feel the weight of absence. The massive stone walls still rise from the Turkish highlands. Lions and sphinxes still guard gates that lead nowhere. Foundations mark where palaces and temples once stood. But the city is empty, has been empty for 3,000 years. The streets are silent. The archives are scattered in museums across Europe. The people who built this place, who walked these streets and prayed in these temples and recorded their lives in cuneiform on clay, they're gone so completely that even their name was forgotten until archaeologists dug it up. This is what the Hittites ultimately teach us. Not their military victories or diplomatic achievements, not their legal sophistication or technological innovations, but their disappearance. The hard lesson that everything ends, that civilizations, no matter how powerful, contain no guarantee of permanence, that memory is harder to preserve than monuments. Think about what it means that an empire could vanish so thoroughly. The Hittites ruled for 5 centuries, longer than the United States has existed. They controlled territories comparable in size to modern Turkey. They fought Egypt to a standstill, revolutionized warfare, developed writing and law and administration. They left massive archaeological remains, thousands of texts, clear evidence of their importance, and still they were forgotten. This should terrify us. We live in a civilization that seems permanent, that has existed for our entire lives and our parents' lives, and stretches back through documented history that feels eternal. We assume continuity, expect that our achievements will be remembered, that our institutions will endure, that the world we know will persist in recognizable form. The Hittites assumed the same things. They were wrong. But it's not just about civilizational collapse, though. That's frightening enough. It's about memory, about how easily the past can be lost even when physical evidence survives. The ruins of Hattusa stood visible for 3 millennia. Travellers saw them, local people knew they were there, the stones didn't disappear. But the meaning was lost. Nobody knew who had built the city, what language its people spoke, what their achievements had been. The monuments endured, but the memory died. This happens constantly in human history. We keep rediscovering lost civilizations, finding evidence of peoples and kingdoms and achievements that nobody remembered. The Indus Valley civilization, contemporary with Egypt and Mesopotamia, completely forgotten until the 20th century. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, elaborate stone temples older than agriculture, unknown until 1994. Who knows what else is buried and forgotten? What other great civilizations have left no trace but ruins nobody has found yet? The Hittites force us to confront historical humility. We don't know the past as well as we think we do. Our histories are incomplete, full of gaps and losses, biased towards civilizations that happen to leave records later cultures could read. Egypt endures in memory partly because its monuments are spectacular, but also because Greek and Roman authors wrote about it, preserving some memory through the classical tradition. The Hittites left comparable monuments, but no such textual tradition, so they vanished. What does this mean for us? Living in an age of digital records and global communications, are we safer from forgetting than Bronze Age civilizations? Or are we actually more vulnerable? Our records are stored electronically, dependent on functioning infrastructure and compatible technology. Will anyone be able to read our digital archives in 3,000 years? Will the servers keep running? Will future archaeologists know how to interpret our data storage media? The Hittites preserved their records on clay tablets, low-tech and fragile but remarkably durable. Fire that destroyed the archives actually preserved them, baking the tablets hard. Our modern storage media are far more efficient but potentially less permanent. Hard drives fail. Digital formats become obsolete. Information stored in the cloud depends on companies and infrastructure that might not exist in a century, let alone 3 millennia. But there's also hope in the Hittite story. They were forgotten but not entirely lost. The tablets survived, the ruins endured, and when circumstances aligned, when archaeologists found Hattusa and linguists deciphered Hittite, the civilization spoke again. Their voices crossed 3,000 years of silence, incomplete and fragmentary, but still audible, still human, still meaningful. This suggests that preservation is possible, but requires effort and luck. The Hittites didn't deliberately preserve their culture for future rediscovery. They just lived, recorded their business and beliefs, built in stone because it was available and durable. That was enough, barely, to survive the catastrophic collapse and the long forgetting that followed. Their legacy is accidental, a side effect of normal bureaucratic record-keeping and monumental architecture. We can do better. We can deliberately preserve knowledge, create redundant archives, store information in multiple formats and locations, write in ways designed for long-term comprehension. We can study how previous civilizations succeeded or failed at preservation and learn from their examples. We can accept that our civilization, like all civilizations, will eventually end, and prepare for that eventuality by safeguarding what we want future people to know. The Hittites also remind us that historical justice requires active remembering. Their civilization was important, contributed significantly to human development, deserved to be remembered. But memory doesn't happen automatically. It requires people actively preserving and transmitting knowledge, choosing what to remember and how to tell it. The Hittites had no such advocates after their empire fell. We can choose to be advocates for truth and memory in our own time. There's something profound about standing where Hittite kings once stood, looking out over the same landscape they saw, knowing we've recovered fragments of their lives and thoughts. It connects us across vast temporal distance, reminds us that humans then were like humans now, struggling with similar questions about power and justice and meaning. They failed to preserve their own memory, but succeeded in being human in ways we still recognize. The ruins don't answer all our questions, they raise new ones. But they testify that civilization is precious and fragile, that achievement is possible but never permanent, that we should work to preserve what matters while accepting that preservation is uncertain. The Hittites lived, built, achieved, and were forgotten. We live, build, achieve, and will eventually be forgotten too. The question is what we do with that knowledge, how we respond to the inevitability of our own impermanence. The stones at Hattusa wait, patient and enduring, holding space for these reflections. The Turkish highlands are quiet in the early morning, mist rising from the valleys around Boğazkale, the small village built near the ancient ruins. The sun climbs over the eastern mountains, touching first the highest points of the old city walls, then gradually illuminating the sprawling archaeological site below. This is the same sun that rose over Hattusa 3,000 years ago, warming the same stones, casting shadows through the same gates. The site is protected now, designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site, maintained by Turkish authorities who understand its importance. Tourists come in summer months, walking paths that follow ancient streets, photographing the Lion Gate and the elaborate rock sanctuary called Yazilikaya. Archaeological teams still excavate carefully, finding new tablets and artifacts, slowly expanding our knowledge. The work continues, patient and methodical, adding fragments to the partial picture we've recovered. But most of the time, Hattusa is empty. The tourists leave, the archaeologists pack up their tools, and the ruins return to silence. The stone lions at the gate stand eternal watch over nothing. The temple foundations mark where gods were once worshipped in elaborate ceremonies. The archive building, where thousands of tablets were stored, is just a pattern of stones outlining rooms that held empires' worth of documents. The city is a memory of itself, less than a ghost, but more than nothing. This is what remains of Hittite power, not the armies that fought Egypt, not the diplomats who negotiated treaties, not the iron weapons or legal codes or sophisticated bureaucracy. Just stones and scattered tablets, fragments that archaeologists and linguists have slowly, painstakingly assembled into a partial understanding of a lost world. It's not much, measured against 5 centuries of empire, but it's something, more than many civilizations left behind. The tablets especially matter, those clay documents baked accidentally into permanence when the city burned. They're distributed now across museums and universities, photographed and catalogued, translated and studied. Scholars still work through them, finding new insights, revising interpretations, gradually building comprehensive understanding. Each tablet is a voice speaking from the Bronze Age, describing a world that vanished but continues to matter. Some tablets have been fully translated, their contents well understood, published in academic journals and incorporated into historical narratives. Others remain puzzling, their vocabulary unclear or their context uncertain. A few probably never will be fully understood, too fragmentary or too specialized. Technical texts about rituals or legal procedures that made sense to contemporary readers but perplex modern scholars. The translation work continues, likely will continue for generations, slowly extracting meaning from 3,000-year-old clay. The ruins and tablets together tell a story, incomplete but compelling. A civilization rose in the Anatolian highlands, built an empire, achieved greatness, then collapsed and was forgotten. For 3 millennia, they existed only as biblical footnotes and mysterious ruins. Then archaeologists found them, linguists read their language, historians reconstructed their story, and now we know, incompletely but genuinely, who the Hittites were and what they achieved. This knowledge matters beyond academic interest. The Hittites demonstrated that sophisticated civilization could develop anywhere, not just in the obviously fertile river valleys of Egypt and Mesopotamia. They showed that Indo-European speakers were in Anatolia much earlier than previously thought, changing our understanding of linguistic and cultural history. They preserved the earliest known Indo-European texts, making Hittite crucial for comparative linguistics. They left legal and diplomatic documents that influenced later traditions. But more than specific contributions, the Hittites teach us about historical contingency and memory. They prove that importance in one's own time doesn't guarantee remembrance, that physical monuments, detailed records, and significant achievements offer no protection against forgetting, that the past is far stranger and more complex than we usually imagine, full of lost civilizations and forgotten achievements, that our historical narratives are incomplete, simplified, potentially wrong about basic facts. This should make us epistemically humble. If an empire as important as the Hittites could be completely forgotten, what else don't we know? What other civilizations have left ruins we haven't found or haven't recognized? What peoples and achievements have vanished, leaving no trace we've discovered? The known past may be just a fraction of the actual past. The well-documented civilizations merely the lucky ones whose records survived and were found. It should also make us think carefully about preservation and memory. The Hittites didn't intend to be forgotten. They built in stone and recorded in writing, trying to ensure their achievements would endure. But preservation requires more than monuments and archives. It requires continuity. people who remember and transmit knowledge, institutions that maintain records, societies that value their history. When that continuity breaks, memory fails even when physical evidence survives. We have better tools for preservation than the Hittites did. We can store vast amounts of information, create redundant archives, communicate globally. But we also have new vulnerabilities, dependence on complex technologies, rapid cultural change, global systems that could fail catastrophically like the Bronze Age system did. We shouldn't assume we're immune to the kind of collapse and forgetting that claimed the Hittites. The morning sun fully illuminates Hattusa now, warming the ancient stones, evaporating the mist. The site looks peaceful, timeless, as if it's been ruins forever and will be ruins forever. But that's an illusion. This was a living city once, full of people and noise and activity, as real and present as any modern city feels to its inhabitants. The silence and emptiness came later, the result of catastrophe and forgetting. Somewhere in those ruins, under stones not yet excavated, there are probably more tablets waiting, more voices from the Bronze Age, more fragments of Hittite history, more pieces of the puzzle. Archaeologists will find them eventually, or perhaps they won't. Either way, the Hittites will remain partially lost, known incompletely, understood imperfectly. That's the nature of archaeology, working with fragments to imagine wholes. But what we have recovered matters. The empire time forgot has been remembered, at least partially. The stones and tablets speak again, telling stories of human ambition and achievement, power and vulnerability, triumph and catastrophic failure. The Hittites lived, and their lives meant something, and now 3,000 years later we know they existed. That's a kind of immortality, imperfect but real, carved in stone and baked in clay, and slowly extracted by patient scholars. The sun rises higher. Hattusa waits, holding its secrets and slowly releasing them, a testament to what endures and what vanishes, to memory and forgetting, to the fragile permanence of human achievement.